everyone. It's me again, Christine Tadop, the founder of UPvisor, and we're going #Excel Live again today to talk about PivotTables. And I'm just going to hang around a little while we wait for more people to join. And even if they don't, it's okay, because I'm still here for you, and I know that the recording is still available afterwards. And maybe just so long to recap on what we've spoken about during the first 2 weeks of our #Excel Live sessions. The very first one was all about like basic formulas, like using functions, and we spoke about auto saving, and there was a third point which I can't remember right now, but that's okay. But they were quite basic. And then last week we spoke about VLOOKUPs and if functions. And those two functions are really pivotal in creating efficiencies when you're using Excel. So if you have not watched those videos and you don't know how to use those functions, you sometimes get confused, then please make a point of going back and watching these videos. Now, these video recordings are saved on Instagram, so you can always go find us there. Hi Ryan Woodendahl, it's nice to see you. So you can go find them on Instagram, but you will also be able to find them on Facebook as well as on our YouTube channel. And if you go have a look at YouTube, you'll see all sorts of things happening there. There's our Finance Friday sessions are going out there, as well as our Excel Live sessions, and any other ways in which we are equipping you, you will also be able to find on our YouTube channel. So we are spreading ourselves so thin at the moment. Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, all sorts. Okay, so yay, Ryan, I'm happy to hear that you're super excited to hear about PivotTables. Now, maybe just to put a disclaimer out there, PivotTables are something that we cover during either our Excel Intermediate or Advanced sessions, our training sessions, and they take like 2 hours to go through. So I'm not going to be able to touch on every single thing that relates to PivotTables today, but it should get you enough information and a good starting point to actually start to get going. So if you have never heard of PivotTables, it really is just a normal range of data. It's a table because it's got special formatting and things like that. But what is really special about PivotTables is that it allows us to dynamically arrange our data. So I'm an accountant, so I've often had to look at financial information, and we've got all sorts of information. Think about what you would see when you pull your bank statement, right? You've got your dates, you've got your descriptions, you've got the amount, you might even know where you bought it, right? But to be able to analyze that amount of information, maybe for yourself on a monthly basis, it's not that hectic. But as soon as you get to a business that has a whole lot of transactions, then it becomes really difficult to actually analyze that information. And we definitely don't want to be filtering individual fields one at a time to be able to get to a point where we can draw a conclusion. So that is really where PivotTables come in. It can take a big set of data, help us to manipulate it, and put in functions and formulas that help us to draw full insights and full details out of that information. It helps us to see trends, it helps us to see relationships between information, and it really just saves us a whole lot of time because we don't have to keep setting up the same thing over and over again. Hey B, thanks for joining. So the thing that makes PivotTables really hard to understand for people that haven't used it before is the fact that you actually have to build up this table. So I'll just talk you generally through this process and try and explain to you, considering the fact that I'm talking to a screen and I don't have a computer in front of me to actually show you how it works. I'll be talking in the air, but basically what you would do is you would firstly, the very first step before you can start using a pivot table is to go prepare your data. We need to go make sure that we've made sure that there's headings for each field and that where there are going to be calculations performed on a specific field, that there are no blanks in it, there are no errors in it, and there's no text. And the reason why we do this is because often when we try and do a sum calculation on one of our fields, for example, we would expect it to automatically do this because there are numbers. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it does a count. And the reason for that is because as soon as it sees in a specific field either text or errors or blanks, it reads that entire field as text. And so what is Excel supposed to do with text other than count it? Because what is there to sum, right? So we'll save a lot of time by making sure the underlying information is correct. The same goes for making sure we're setting up our dates correctly before we start doing our pivot tables, because if we can set up our dates correctly, then that automatically means that Excel, with its clever automatically making things happen brain, allows us to build up some date hierarchies within the pivot table, and that is really useful. Okay, so first go make sure your information is quality checked, it is under control, you've gotten rid of all of the blanks, no empty rows, no empty columns, whatever. Hey Emma. Okay, so first do that. Then your next step will be basically to go insert your pivot table. So you'll go select your range of data, make sure you're including all of your headings. Okay, that is really important, because otherwise how does it know how it's supposed to name the field? Okay, then you'll go click on insert, and then you'll see there's an option to click on pivot table. Now as soon as you get the pivot table window, you shouldn't need to change anything. Make it go to a new worksheet, that's all good. Press OK, and then you will see that there's a new sheet that comes up. There's normally like a little empty block that's on the top left hand side of your sheet that comes up. And then importantly, there's a field pane that comes up on the right hand side. And that field pane is where we are going to be building our pivot table. Now using a pivot table, as soon as you've actually understood the basics, is actually really easy, because it is as simple as just clicking one of the fields and dragging it into one of 4 areas in your pivot table. So I'm going to talk very hypothetically here. So let's think about that bank statement that I mentioned just now. I've got my date, I've got a description, and I've got an amount. Let's just go with those 3. Okay, so I've got 3 columns, and date, description, and amount are the 3 things that will come up in my field areas. Okay, and those are the 3 fields that I'm able to go map in my pivot table. Okay, so all of my fields will be listed at the top, and then on the bottom right hand side you'll see 4 blocks coming up. Now those 4 blocks have either a filter, rows, columns, or values. Those are 4 options. And if you think about how Excel has been set up, our rows basically running underneath each other, they work exactly the same in a pivot table, and columns would run across. And the value section, that's where we're going to do our calculations. So maybe I want to see how much I've been spending over the last 3 months based on my description. Okay, great. I'm going to take my description, I'm going to put it in the rows section, and it will list all of them underneath each other. Great. And then I want to see across the 3 months to be able to calculate an average maybe. Okay, so I want it to go across. So I'll take my date and I'll drag it into the column section. And because it's under the column section, and because I fixed my dates first, and it's now got a, hey Kim, it's now got the date hierarchy built in, I'll be able to actually get a summary of each of the months running across. Okay. And then I'm wanting to see the actual values, right? So I'll take my values and I'll go drop it under the values section, and it should automatically do a sum if you have set up your data correctly. And that is really as simple as that. What you would now see coming up in your pivot table is all of your descriptions running underneath each other with all of your values running across. And there you've just built your first pivot table. And now you might say, okay, but there are too many descriptions here. I'm trying to group things. I want to see like how much have I spent on food, and how much have I spent on fuel, and how much have I spent on, I don't know, spoiling my husband, okay? And what you can then do is start building up that pivot table to start either grouping that information together, or you can go back to your underlying data and add in an extra column that allows you to calculate or to determine what category it should fall under. And if you do that, then think about it. Your pivot table has now grown, right? We have to go just reselect our range of data so that extra column is included. And maybe while I'm on this here, if there is any calculation that's happening, or if any of the values in your underlying data changes, a pivot table is a little bit different from a normal function. It doesn't automatically calculate in the background. We actually have to go tell that pivot table to refresh. And this is something that people often forget about. So it's really easy. You go right click on your pivot table and you'll see that there's an option that says refresh pivot. When you do that, poof, all of the new information comes in, and the same would go for any updated content that you've got, any new columns that have been added if it's in the middle. Okay. So now I've got this extra description or this extra category, and I now want to start grouping by category. So what I'll do, I now have a new field that's called category in my field area section. I'll click and drag it into the rows section, because what I want, hey Terence, is to see first my category and then my description. Okay, so if I want to see my category first, I have to make sure that that field is first in my row section. So I'll have my category and then my description underneath it. And you'll then see that your pivot table automatically will start grouping some of that information. Now there's a lot that we can do in terms of the way that our pivot tables look. There's a lot of functionality in terms of filters. So I'll just point you in the right direction here, and you need to go play with it, and it's all obviously dependent on the type of information you've got. And you can change the way that your pivot table looks on the design tab. So there are two tabs that will come up. There's analyze or design. And under design, you are able to change all of your colors, which is great. But the part that I want to mention is you can change the layout of your pivot table. If you change the layout of your pivot table, by default, it will normally have information underneath each other. But maybe if you want it to be next to each other, so spread out across the different columns, it makes it much easier to read. And you can go do that on the layout section. And you can change it to tabular format, and then you will see everything listed next to each other. Then you might also see options like saying, I want to switch on subtotals or not, or I want to repeat item labels, which is basically saying every time that it says fuel, it's going to repeat it underneath each other, as opposed to having fuel as a heading and then having blanks underneath. Okay, so there's really a lot to pivot tables. Some of the most common issues I've already mentioned. It's like having the count instead of a sum, and it would be sometimes we don't give a column heading, so then it tells us it can't create this pivot table because there's no field name for it. Those would be the two most common ones, and then forgetting to refresh. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a basic understanding of using pivot tables. And if you want, you're welcome to pop some comments or questions into the chat so long while I just finish this up, and then I will get to those questions. So I just want to remind you, next week, Monday and Tuesday, we will be having an Excel basic session happening over Zoom, which will be lots of fun, from 8 o'clock until 1 o'clock. And our entries will be closing, our registrations, not our entries, will be closing for that probably tomorrow. So please do get in touch with us so that we can make sure that we've got enough people to make that go ahead. Okay, and we will pop the link in the comments below as well, so you can go sign up. The price is $1,250 per person. Definitely worth coming to check out. You get your test of competence. We talk about sum, min, max, average. We talk about formatting. We talk about printing. We talk about freeze panes, which is something we'll also be addressing next week. So that brings me to the topic of next week. So next week we will be talking about the ways that you can create efficiencies in using Excel through navigating well, which would include things like keyboard shortcuts as well as using freeze panes. So if you do have any questions about keyboard shortcuts or freeze panes or any other questions about navigating through Excel, then please also drop us a comment below. And we will make sure that we incorporate that as part of our next session next week. Okay, so I think that is everything that I wanted to mention about pivot tables. If you would like to learn more about pivot tables, you should definitely come join one of our intermediate training sessions, which we're still deciding on a date for that one, but keep your eyes open for that. And then while I have a captive audience, I will just remind you of our free webinar that's happening next week, Wednesday at 1 o'clock, our Power Hour with Christine, where we will be talking about why budgeting is not a curse word, but cutting costs should be. So I would like to invite you to come join us for that session. And you can also come check us out tomorrow on Facebook, same time, not the same place, where we will be talking about pivoting in your business during and after COVID-19. Okay, so it doesn't look like there are any other specific questions for this session, but I hope you found it helpful, and we will see you talking #Excel Live again next week, 1 o'clock on Instagram. I will see you then. Goodbye.